August 1966, the Sands Hotel, Las Vegas, Nevada, 1:30 a.m. Dean Martin sat in his dressing room, tuxedo jacket off, bow tie undone, a glass of what looked like whiskey on the counter in front of him. Apple juice, always apple juice. The show had ended 2 hours earlier. Another Rat Pack performance. Dean, Frank, Sammy. The same jokes, the same songs, the same choreographed spontaneity that audiences paid premium prices to witness. Dean had been doing this for years. The performing, the joking, the carefully managed chaos of the Rat Pack. He was good at it. Better than good. He made it look effortless. Made the whole thing seem like 5 friends having fun rather than 5 professionals executing a highly rehearsed production. That was Dean's gift, making performance look like life. But tonight he was tired. Not the regular tired that comes from 2 shows and 4 hours on stage. A different kind of tired. The tired that comes from performing even when you're not performing. From being Dean Martin every hour of every day. From never getting to be just Dino. He was reaching for his street clothes when the door opened. No knock. Just opened. Frank Sinatra stood in the doorway, still in his tuxedo, glass in his hand. Real whiskey. Frank's eyes were sharp but unfocused in that particular way that meant he'd been drinking since the show ended. Maybe before. Dean. Frank's voice had that edge to it. The edge that people who knew him recognized. The edge that meant something had been bothering him and he'd decided it was time to address it. Frank. Dean's voice was neutral, calm, the way it always was. Frank walked into the dressing room, closed the door behind him, stood there looking at Dean with an expression that was part anger, part hurt, part something else Dean couldn't quite identify. "We need to talk." Dean set down the shirt he'd been about to put on. "About what?" Frank took a drink, set the glass down harder than necessary. "About this." He gestured vaguely at the room, at the space between them, at everything. "About us, about the Rat Pack, about what we're doing here." Dean waited. He'd known Frank long enough to know that when Frank started a conversation this way, the best thing to do was let him get to the point in his own time. Frank paced. 3 steps one way. 3 steps back. The nervous energy of someone who'd been holding something in too long and was finally letting it out. "You know what I realized tonight," Frank said. "Watching you up there. Doing your thing. Getting your laughs, playing drunk. Playing the role." Dean said nothing. "I realized you're faking it." The words hung in the air. Dean's expression didn't change. "Faking what?" "All of it," Frank said. His voice was getting louder now, more aggressive. "The friendship. The loyalty. The whole Rat Pack thing. You're performing it, just like you perform the drunk bit. Just like you perform everything." Dean looked at Frank. Really looked at him. Saw the anger. The hurt underneath it. The fear underneath that. "Frank?" "Don't?" Frank interrupted. "Don't do that thing where you smooth it over. Where you make a joke and change the subject and pretend I didn't just say what I said." Dean stood up, faced Frank directly. "What do you want me to say?" "I want you to tell me I'm wrong," Frank said. "I want you to tell me that the friendship is real. That when we're up there together, you actually give a damn. That this isn't just another gig for you." Dean held Frank's gaze and said 5 words. 5 words that ended the Rat Pack. 5 words that Frank Sinatra would never forget. 5 words that were absolutely true. "I'm not faking, Frank." Pause. "But I'm done performing off stage too." The silence that followed was complete. Frank stared at Dean, processing what he'd just heard, understanding it, hating it, because Dean hadn't denied the accusation, hadn't defended the friendship, hadn't tried to convince Frank he was wrong. He'd just drawn a line, had said with perfect clarity that he was finished. Finished performing friendship, finished performing loyalty, finished being Dean Martin when he wasn't being paid to be Dean Martin. Frank's face went through several expressions. Shock, anger, something that looked like grief. "So that's it?" Frank said finally. "That's all I get? After everything we've been through?" "That's all either of us gets," Dean said quietly. "That's all anyone gets. The performance or the person, not both." "Not anymore." Dean picked up his shirt, started putting it on. The conversation was over. Frank stood there for a long moment. Then he picked up his glass, drained it, set it down. "You know what you're doing," Frank said. "Ending this. The Rat Pack. Everything we built. Everything we built." Dean buttoned his shirt. "I know." Frank waited. Seemed to expect Dean to say more. "Take it back. To apologize." Didn't. Frank walked to the door, opened it, stopped. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a test. Den met his eyes. "You'll see Dean Martin tomorrow. That's who you hired. That's who you get." Frank nodded slowly, walked out, closed the door behind him. Dean stood in his dressing room, alone, and something that had been holding together for years finally let go. The Rat Pack didn't officially end that night in August 1966. They kept performing together, kept doing the shows, kept making money. But everyone who knew them understood. Something had broken, something fundamental, and it was never coming back. Nobody knew exactly what Dean said to Frank in that dressing room. Nobody knew what Frank said first. Nobody knew why that particular night was the night it all fell apart. The story stayed buried for decades, until the people who'd been there decided the truth mattered more than the legend. By August 1966, the Rat Pack had been the defining entertainment institution of Las Vegas for the better part of a decade. The Sands Hotel was their home, the Copa Room their stage, the casino floor their playground, the suites above it all their private world. They had made Las Vegas into something it hadn't been before they arrived. Not just a place where people went to gamble, but a place where people went to feel connected to something glamorous and alive and contemporary. Dean, Frank, Sammy, Peter Lawford, Joey Bishop. The names were inseparable from the idea of what Las Vegas could be at its best. By 1966, though, the institution was showing strain that the performances didn't reveal and the publicity machinery worked hard to conceal. The Kennedy connection had unraveled in November 1963 when everything the administration represented ended in Dallas. Peter Lawford's usefulness to the group had diminished in proportion to his diminishing Kennedy connection, and his personal struggles were becoming harder to manage. Sammy was carrying his own weight of complications. Frank was 40 years old and beginning to feel the particular pressure of a man who had defined an era, wondering what came after. And Dean was performing, always performing. The shows were still packed, the money was still extraordinary. The audiences still came in enormous numbers to see what they'd come to see. The Rat Pack, the legend, the performance. But inside the performance, underneath the careful choreography of spontaneity, things were different than they had been in 1960 or 1961. The joy that had originally animated the whole enterprise, the genuine delight of talented people performing together at the height of their powers, had become something more mechanical, more professional, more like work. Dean felt this more acutely than the others, or at least, he felt it in a way he couldn't ignore. Den Martin and Frank Sinatra had been navigating their friendship for nearly 20 years by the time August 1966 arrived. They'd met in the late 1940s when both were still climbing. Den, the Italian kid from Steubenville, working his way up through nightclubs and early television. Frank, the Jersey boy who'd already had his first wave of success and was in the complicated middle period between his early fame and his later reinvention. They'd recognized something in each other from the beginning. Not just talent. They were both surrounded by talented people, but a particular quality of self-possession, of knowing what they were and refusing to apologize for it, that made them natural allies in an entertainment world that constantly demanded people make themselves smaller or more accommodating than they actually were. The early friendship had been real. Nobody who knew both of them in those years disputed that. They'd spent time together that wasn't about the business, had conversations that went past the professional, had shown each other the versions of themselves that they didn't show audiences. Frank had been there for Dean through personal difficulties. Dane had been there for Frank through the career valleys that even the greatest entertainers experience. They'd built something genuine. What happened to it wasn't a single event. It was gradual, the way important things usually end. Not in a moment, but in an accumulation of moments, each one individually small, collectively decisive. As the Rat Pack grew from friendship into institution, the personal relationship had to make room for the professional one. And the professional one, with its bookings and its billing and its carefully managed public image, took up more and more of the space where the friendship had been. By 1964, by 1965, by the summer of 1966, Dean and Frank spent most of their time together in professional contexts, on stage, in planning meetings, in the public-facing situations that required them to be the Rat Pack rather than two men who knew each other well. The private conversations happened less often. The calls that were just about talking, not about booking, not about business, had become rare. Neither of them had addressed this directly. Neither of them had named what was happening. Until Frank, drinking in the early hours of a Las Vegas morning, finally said out loud what he'd been sensing for years. Dean Martin's exhaustion by 1966 was not the kind that headlines capture. He was not visibly struggling. The performances were still excellent. The reviews were still positive. Audiences who saw him on stage in August 1966 saw exactly what they'd always seen: the effortless charm, the perfect timing, the voice that could fill a room without effort. What they didn't see was what it cost. Dean had been performing continuously without real interruption since he was a teenager. The nightclubs, the partnership with Jerry Lewis, the solo career, the movies, the television show, the Rat Pack. Each phase had required not just the actual performances, but the constant maintenance of the persona that made the performances make sense. You couldn't be Dean Martin on stage on Friday night if you'd been visibly Dino on Thursday. The persona had to be consistent, had to be available, had to be present even when you were technically off duty. The apple juice in the whiskey glass was the symbol of this. The 30-year performance that never stopped, that had to be maintained even in situations where most people would simply be themselves. Dean had constructed this very deliberately, and he understood exactly what he was doing. But even deliberate constructions accumulate weight over time. Even carefully maintained performances have a cost that compounds. By 1966, that cost was showing up in ways that Dean recognized privately even if nobody else did. He was spending more time wanting to be Dino and less time willing to be Dean. Wanting to sit quietly somewhere without performing for anyone. Wanting to have a conversation that wasn't, at some level, part of the act. The Rat Pack made this harder rather than easier. The Rat Pack required constant performance, even in the backstage spaces, even in the dressing rooms, even in the social hours after the shows. Because the audience for the Rat Pack performance extended past the Copa room into every room where Rat Pack members were present. Den was aware of this weight long before August 1966 forced him to acknowledge it out loud. People who knew about what happened in that dressing room, who'd heard fragments, who'd witnessed the aftermath, who'd pieced together the story from the accounts of people who'd been present, formed 8 distinct theories about what had actually caused the confrontation and what it had actually meant. All 8 were wrong in ways that illuminated something about why the real story had stayed hidden so long. The first theory was that the fight had been about money, about billing, about percentages, about the financial arrangements that governed how Rat Pack earnings were divided. This theory appealed to people who preferred their Hollywood stories to be about greed, rather than psychology. It was wrong. The second theory introduced a woman, held that some romantic complication, some jealousy or betrayal in the personal lives of either Frank or Dean had supplied the real fuel for what happened. This theory was wrong and required ignoring everything that was actually known about the nature of the conflict. The third theory was the most obvious one, and therefore the one most people defaulted to. That Frank's ego and Dean's resentment of it had finally reached a breaking point after years of accumulated tension. Frank's need to be the center of every room. Dean's resistance to being anyone's supporting player. The clash of two enormous personalities that had been building since the beginning. This theory contains something real about the underlying dynamic but was wrong as a complete explanation for what happened in August 1966. The fourth theory put Sammy Davis, Jr., at the center of it, suggested that Sammy had said something to Frank about Dean, or to Dean about Frank, that had accelerated a confrontation that might otherwise have taken longer to arrive. People who knew Sammy found this theory unfair to a man who spent his entire time in the Rat Pack trying to keep its members together rather than driving them apart. The theory was wrong. The fifth theory could connect the confrontation to the Kennedy assassination, suggested that the loss of the political connection that had given the Rat Pack some of its cultural meaning had left Frank feeling the group's irrelevance, and Dean's relative difference to that irrelevance had felt like betrayal. This theory had more psychological sophistication than most, but was wrong as a direct explanation for what happened in the dressing room. The sixth theory was the most flattering to Dean, held that he had actively building toward a solo career for years. By 1966, that his television show had given him an independent platform, and that the confrontation with Frank was a calculated step toward separation he'd been planning for some time. This theory misread Dean's character. He didn't plan exits. He found them when he needed them. The theory was wrong. The seventh theory focused on Frank's drinking, suggested that what happened that night was simply the product of alcohol and a paranoid man in a bad state, that the conversation would never have happened sober, that its significance had been retrospectively inflated by people who wanted there to be a meaning to the Rat Pack's decline. This theory was wrong because it ignored the fact that Frank was often drunk and only rarely said things this direct. The drinking was a condition, not an explanation. The eighth theory was the one closest to the surface. Simple burnout, simple exhaustion, two men who'd been performing together long enough that the performance had stopped being sustainable. This theory was closer to the truth than the others, but still incomplete. It got the what without getting the why, without understanding what the exhaustion actually meant to Dean and what Frank's accusation actually represented. All wrong. The truth was simpler and more painful than any of them. This wasn't just about Frank being drunk and picking a fight. This wasn't just about Den being tired after a long show. This was about what happens when performance becomes identity. When the character you play starts demanding things the person underneath can't give. Dean Martin had been performing for 40 years by 1966. Performing on stage, performing in interviews, performing at parties, performing in his friendships. The drunk bit, the cool guy persona, the effortless charm that made everything look easy. All performance, all carefully maintained. And somewhere along the way, the people in Dean's life stopped seeing the performance and started believing it was who he really was. Started expecting him to be Dean Martin every minute of every day. Frank was one of those people, had been for years, and on that night in August 1966, Dean was finally tired enough to say no. But nobody knew what actually happened in that dressing room. Not for decades. If stories like this matter to you, the moments when someone chooses themselves over the performance, subscribe now. There's an entire Dean Martin playlist of these untold truths. The accounts that emerged in the years after August 1966, the testimonies of people who had been present or proximate to what happened in the dressing room that night, built a picture of the event without ever completing it. Sammy Davis Jar, speaking to a journalist in the mid-1980s about the Rat Pack's dissolution, said that something broke between Frank and Dean in the summer of 1966 that he'd never been able to fully explain. He said he'd noticed the change immediately, that the shows continued but the quality of the connection between the two men on stage was different after that summer, more professional and less personal, and that anyone who watched closely enough could feel the difference even if they couldn't name it. Sammy said he'd asked Dean once, quietly, what had happened, and Dean had told him it was between him and Frank and had changed the subject. Nobody who heard Sammy discuss had ever gotten more than that from him. A member of the Sands Hotel management staff, speaking in a 1990 interview about the hotel's golden era, described noticing a change in the atmosphere of the Rat Pack's backstage environment beginning in August of that year. He said the dressing room visits that had been a normal part of the post-show ritual, the informal gathering, the drinks, the conversations that continued the energy of the performance into the small hours of the morning, had become less frequent, less spontaneous, more abbreviated. He didn't know why. He'd heard fragments of what happened, but couldn't confirm any of them. He said the energy changed. Said everyone who worked the shows could feel it. Nobody who worked there discussed it openly. Den's daughter, speaking in a 1998 interview about her father's career and personal life, said she'd noticed a shift in him beginning sometime in the mid-1960s. Said he seemed more settled in himself, quieter, less performing even in private, and that while she hadn't understood it at the time, in retrospect she understood it as her father finally allowing himself to be who he actually was rather than who the world expected him to be. She didn't mention Frank by name. She didn't describe a specific event, but she dated the change to roughly the period of August 1966 in ways that aligned with everything else that was known about the dressing room confrontation. A biographer who had spent years reaching Frank Sinatra's life and had conducted interviews with dozens of people who knew him well wrote in 2015 about Frank's relationship with Dean in the years after the Rat Pack's peak. He described Frank as carrying a regret about Dean that he couldn't fully articulate even to the people closest to him. A sense that something had been lost in their relationship that Frank never had been able to recover or replace. A friendship that had been real once and had become something else, and that Frank, for all his famous toughness, had mourned quietly for the rest of his life. The biographer didn't have the specifics of what had happened in August 1966, but he had the emotional aftermath, and the emotional aftermath pointed clearly toward a conversation that had changed everything. Nobody knew for decades the exact content of what passed between Frank and Dean in that dressing room. Nobody knew which words specifically had landed like the final blow. The story existed as presence without content, as a moment that everyone who knew the Rat Pack understood had occurred without being able to say precisely what it had been. Until enough time passed. If you were Don Martin in August 1966, if your closest professional brother accused you of faking your friendship, if you had to choose between performing forever and protecting what was left of yourself, what would you say? Would you defend the friendship? Would you lie to keep the peace? Or would you do what Den did? If you want to know exactly what Dean said, the words that ended the Rat Pack, subscribe. The full conversation is coming. What nobody understood at the time was that Frank's accusation came from a real place, from years of watching Dean hold something back, from sensing that Dean was present but not fully present, that he showed up, did the work, collected the check, and went home to a part of himself that Frank never got access to. And Frank, who gave everything to his friendships, who demanded total loyalty, who needed people to be as committed to him as he was to them. Couldn't handle it. The conversation in the dressing room that night went longer than the hook suggests. After Dean said he was done performing off stage, Frank pushed. "What does that even mean?" Frank demanded. "Done performing off stage? We're friends, Dean. Friends don't perform for each other." Dean sat down, looked at Frank with something close to pity. "Frank," he said, "we haven't been friends in years. We've been coworkers who are very good at pretending to be friends. For the audience, for the cameras, for the legend." "That's bullshit," Frank said. But his voice was less certain now. "Is it?" Dean asked. "When's the last time we had a conversation that wasn't about the show? About booking? About the next gig?" Frank opened his mouth, closed it, couldn't answer. "When's the last time you called me just to talk?" Dean continued. "Not to complain about someone, not to plan something. Just to talk, as friends." "You can't remember?" Dean said. "Neither can I, because we're not friends anymore, Frank. We're the Rat Pack. We're a brand. We're a business. And I'm tired of pretending that's the same thing as friendship." Frank's anger was draining away, being replaced by something worse. Understanding. "So what are you saying?" Frank asked quietly. "You want out." "I'm saying I want to stop lying," Dean said. "To you. To myself. To everyone. I'll show up. I'll do the shows. I'll be professional. But I'm not going to pretend anymore that what we have is deeper than what it actually is." Frank asked. "Actually?" Den thought about it. "Mutual benefit," he said finally. "You get the cool factor I bring. I get the access your name provides. We both make money. We both stay relevant. But it's business, Frank. It's been business for a long time." Frank looked like he'd been hit. "That's really what you think?" "That's what I know," Dean said. Not cruel, just honest. Frank paced again, then stopped. "You know what the worst part is?" Frank said. "I hate that you're right, but you're right." Dean said nothing. "When did it happen?" Frank asked. "When did we stop being friends and start being this?" "Gradually," Dean said. "Over years. So gradually neither of us noticed until it was already done." Frank sat down, suddenly looked very tired. "I needed to hear you say it wasn't true," he said. "I needed you to tell me I was crazy, that the friendship was real, even if we both knew it was a lie." "I can't do that anymore," Dean said. "I can't perform off stage, not even for you. Especially not for you." They sat in silence. Two men who'd been brothers, who'd defined an era together, who'd made each other famous in ways neither could have managed alone, and who'd just acknowledged that it was over. Not with a fight, not with drama, just with truth. Frank stood up. "Tomorrow night's show," he said. "You'll be there, I'll be there," Don said. "Dean Martin will be there." "Professional time. Prepared. But that's all I'm giving you, Frank. That's all I have left to give." Frank nodded. "I guess that'll have to be enough." He walked to the door, paused. "For what it's worth," Frank said, "I'm sorry that I pushed you to this, that I needed you to be something you couldn't be." Dean looked up, met Frank's eyes. "I'm sorry too," Dean said, "that I couldn't be it." Frank left. The door closed, and the Rat Pack, the real Rat Pack, the friendship underneath the performance, ended. To understand why Dean's exhaustion had finally reached this breaking point in August 1966, you have to go back further than the Rat Pack, further than Las Vegas, further than the constructed character of Dean Martin, the effortless charmer. You have to go back to Dino Crosetti, the boy from Steubenville who had invented Dean Martin as a tool, the way you invent any tool, because there was a job that needed doing and Dino didn't have the right equipment, and so he built it. The drunk act came from the same place. The apple juice in the whiskey glass, the carefully practiced stumble, the slur calibrated to a precise point on the dial between endearing and incoherent. All of it built deliberately, all of it maintained consciously, All of it designed to put audiences at ease by giving them a character they could recognize and trust. What Dino had not anticipated in the beginning was the degree to which the tool would become the identity. Not inside himself. He always knew who he was underneath Dean Martin, but in the perception of everyone around him. The performing had always been understood by its audiences and by the industry as simply who Dean Martin was rather than as a construction built by Dino Crossetti for specific professional purposes. And because it was understood that way by everyone around him, it was expected to be available constantly, to be turned on whenever someone wanted it on. The apple juice was easy. That was just what was in the glass and nobody checked the glass. But the persona was harder. The persona required presence, required maintenance, required Dino to absent himself and Dean to take his place every time the situation called for it. And by 1966, the situation called for it almost constantly. The shows, the meetings, the social obligations, the public appearances, the private gatherings of famous and powerful people who expected Dean Martin to be Dean Martin and felt somehow cheated if Dino Crossetti showed up instead. The exhaustion was not about the work. Dean liked the work. He was good at the work, and he knew it, and the knowledge gave him genuine satisfaction. The exhaustion was about the constancy, about never being off, about the apple juice being in the glass even in rooms where nobody was watching, because by 1966 Dean had been doing it so long he couldn't always tell anymore which rooms those were. Frank Sinatra's relationship with control and loyalty was one of the most documented aspects of his character. Documented because it was visible, because it expressed itself in ways that the people around him could observe and describe, because Frank himself was not always subtle about it. He needed loyalty in the way that people who've been abandoned need loyalty, urgently, unconditionally, as a constant reassurance rather than a presumed background condition. His friendships were intense, his demands on them were real, and when he felt them weakening, he took it personally in ways that could turn hurt to anger with unsettling speed. The drinking accelerated this, not created it. The underlying dynamic was there sober, but removed whatever modulation Frank normally applied to the expression of it. When Frank drank in the way he was drinking on the night of August 1966, the things he'd been carefully not saying tended to surface. He'd been watching Dean for months with the particular attentiveness of someone who suspects something is wrong but hasn't yet confirmed what. He'd seen the slight distance, never large enough to point to directly, never dramatic enough to confront, but there. Consistent. A degree of presence withheld, a corner of Dean that remained Dino even when everything else was performing Dean. Frank took this personally because Frank took everything personally, because his whole life had been built on intensity of connection and the suggestion that someone was not fully giving themselves to that connection felt like betrayal. By the time he walked into Dean's dressing room, he'd been carrying this feeling for long enough that it had fermented into something sharper than hurt. It had become conviction, an accusation already formed, looking for the moment to be spoken. The Rat Pack continued after August 1966. That much was verifiable. The shows went on, the bookings continued, the audiences kept coming. But the people who watched closely and knew both men described the period from late 1966 onward as fundamentally different from what had preceded it. Sammy held the middle as he always had, but the middle was harder to hold when the two anchoring it were no longer choosing to be held. Dean's television show gave him an independent platform that the Rat Pack had never been able to give him, a space that was entirely his, where he didn't have to navigate Frank's energy or manage the expectations of the collective. He found in that space something he'd been missing for years. Room to be slightly more Dino. Room for the warmth that was real alongside the performance that was constructed. Frank worked more with others, with people whose loyalty he could still experience as unconditional, because they hadn't yet had the conversation that Dean had forced them to have. Dean held the line he'd drawn that August night. He continued to work with Frank when the work made sense. He was professional, reliable, skilled. But he didn't perform off stage anymore. He'd said he was done with it, and he meant it. Frank never fully forgave this, the biographers said. Couldn't quite make his peace with a friendship that had been renegotiated into something more honest but less warm. That was the paradox of what Dean had done. By refusing to pretend, he'd made the reality of their connection clearer, and the reality was less than Frank had wanted it to be. The story of Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra in that dressing room at the Sands Hotel is not a story about the failure of friendship. It is a story about the limits of performance and the courage it takes to stop performing when the performance has become the thing that's destroying you. Dean didn't end the Rat Pack that night. The Rat Pack had already been ending gradually in the way that all things end when the need they served has been exhausted. What Dean did was name what was happening. Clearly, without cruelty, without pretense. At a moment when Frank's pain had forced the question into the open, he chose honesty over comfort, chose himself over the legend, chose Dino over Dean in the room where it counted most. That choice cost him something real. But what it gave him was more important. For the first time in years, he walked out of that dressing room as himself. August 1966. A dressing room at the Sands Hotel. Frank Sinatra accused Dean Martin of faking their friendship. Dean didn't deny it. Instead, he said the words that changed everything. "I'm done performing off stage too." The Rat Pack ended that night. Not officially, but really. Some friendships end with fights. Some end with distance. Dean and Frank's friendship ended with honesty, with Dean finally admitting he couldn't be Dean Martin every minute of his life, that he needed to be Dino sometimes too. If you want to see more stories about Dean Martin, the moments he chose himself, the times he drew lines, the man underneath the performance, there's an entire playlist waiting. These stories don't stay online forever. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.